Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive Perspective. We're always tackling issues which are going right for the jugular, often of establishment and often of legacy media, tackling those issues which are covered up, hidden, and often obfuscated in terms of the truth. Today is no different. We have in the studio Fra Hughes from the Independent Activist podcast, and I've also got Tara O'Grady, who's also human rights activist. I think I'll best describe that, although she's a woman with many, many portfolios. We're going to uncover some of them. But in this context, we're talking about both Tara and Fra, who were on the Sumud Flotilla and have some absolutely amazing experiences to share with us. Of course, we all saw the process of the flotilla heading for its objective of trying to feed little children in Gaza, taking medication to them. And then we saw the reaction that the Israeli entity carried out. We're going to hopefully get some real human stories out of this particular show. So welcome to the show first, Fra. You were on the boat with Tag Hickey, who we interviewed during that period. You were also there with the likes of Greta Thunberg. There were some really interesting and very committed characters. But tell me a little bit about, first of all, the journey itself and how you kind of coped with things and what you saw and how you dealt with it all.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to put things in context. What I'd like to say is everyone has a pivotal moment, something that happens that they then get involved on the path to Palestine, on the road to Al-Quds. And for me, it was Operation Cast Lead, when they murdered 45 children over 10 days. And then subsequent to that, you had the Mavi Marmara. That was the ship that was attacked on the 31st of May, 2010. They murdered 10 people on that boat, including an American-Turkish dual citizen called Furkan Dogan. Furkan was training to be a doctor. His dream was to cure blindness in Africa. And his death was at the hands of these Zionist baby killers who boarded the boat and shot him. So on one hand, you have someone dreaming of curing blindness in Africa, being murdered by someone who has no value for human life other than Israeli life. So that was in May 2010. 6 months later, I was on a convoy with George Galloway to Gaza. We delivered a 13-seater wheelchair-accessible minibus to the Al-Quds hospital. But I actually spoke at Furkan Dogan's grave on the way to Syria as part of our convoy. I said that a martyr had fallen. He had dropped the torch. And I posed the question, who will pick up the torch? Little did I know that 15 years later, I would pick up that torch, and along with Tara and nearly 500 other people, doctors, nurses, politicians, humanitarians, political activists, people of all faiths, politics and none, went to challenge that siege. They went to bring, when we hear the Palestinians say, where is the world? Why does no one help? Why does no one hear us? On the flotilla, we said, we see you, we hear you, we are coming. So it wasn't about the flotilla. It's not about me. It's not about Tara. It's not about Greta Thunberg. It was about the genocidal ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population, Palestinian population of Gaza and the West Bank. That's why we were on the flotilla. We had baby milk, we had rice, we had pasta, we had all types of food supplements in order to bring a maritime lifeline to the people of Gaza. That's why we were all on the flotilla. And my experience, which is slightly different from Tara's, is that I was on the SS Alma. That was like the mothership. We carried 50,000 litres of diesel. And every 4 days, the other 40 sailing ships, we give them diesel and water to allow them to continue in their journey. Our boat was bombed in Sidi Bou Said. First, they firebombed the SS Family. Then they firebombed the Alma that both me and Tara were on. They had a drone that dropped flammable liquids onto the wooden deck of the Alma, trying to disable the boat, trying to set it on fire. Then in international waters, they had 11 attacks on the smaller sailing ships. So at one point, we are stationary. We can see in a semicircle all the boats that were involved in the flotilla. We could see the lights. The bigger the ship, the taller the mast, the higher you could see the lights going up into the sky. It was a beautiful thing to see. All these people, 44 countries, 15 nationalities alone on our boat. And we saw 11 of those sailing ships get attacked by drones. At one stage I saw one, it was like a Second World War dive bomber. It came from nowhere. It zoomed across the sky. It hovered above the targeted ship. And then we saw a flash of light. And then we heard the bang of the explosion. Now, in my naivety, I thought these might be the flashbang grenades they threw at Palestinians in the West Bank, at the like stun grenades and flash grenades. But what they were trying to do was to damage the sailing masts so that the ships couldn't sail. But also it was intimidation. It was trying to discourage people from continuing the journey. So first we're bombed in Tunisia, then we're bombed in the Mediterranean, and we're constantly hearing how we're all terrorists, we're all going to jail for months, we're all going to be in the deepest, darkest dungeons in a Negev desert. And part of my fear at one stage is if there's one thing worse than not getting to Gaza, it would be if they let us to Gaza and didn't let us out. If they said, you want to go to Gaza, you go ahead, but hey, you can stay there, you know.
That's an absolutely, riveting account, because you've covered so much of what I would have asked: the drones, the terror, the threats, the violence, basically of psychological as well as physical, seems to have been very much part of that narrative there. Tara, I'm going to come to you because I'll come back to you, Fra, and maybe get some more accounts of what happened, go into even greater depth on those incidents. But Tara, your experience obviously wasn't entirely the same as Fra's because you were on a different ship. But tell me about the journey for you, from your perspective. What were the kind of the things that stand out in your mind, first of all?
Actually, Fra and I were on the same ship. We were both on the mothership, the Alma.
Okay.
I was the senior coordinator on the vessel. So my responsibility was really to keep harmony on the vessel, to encourage people to work together. And, hardly any of us knew each other when we first boarded. And by the time we left, we really felt that we were a clan. It was the vessel that had all of the, I suppose, senior personalities, and the steering committee on it was the Alma, or rather the family vessel. And to delineate ourselves from the family vessel, we called ourselves the Alma clan. There were people who were, obviously sailors, but also people who were plumbers and electricians. And yes, we had a couple of members of parliament. Ty Kickey, fantastic comedian from Cork, brilliant satirist. Definitely the making of a great statesman in that character. Fra, whom I've known for the last couple of years as a really dedicated, independent humanitarian character. Myself, Chief Mandela was on our vessel, and then eventually Greta also joined us. It was just extraordinary to be with people who were from all walks of life with exactly the same ethos to try to alleviate the suffering in Gaza and to make a mark for the thousands of people who would have done the voyage, who wanted to. And I know, we had over 20,000 applicants to join us. I had spent the preceding weeks interviewing captains and crew to join. Some people who were extraordinarily well accomplished in seafaring and had been mariners for years, but who didn't quite fit the criteria that we needed for this particular voyage. And then the people who did. When we got to Barcelona, I was put in charge of the security, which, you know, I thoroughly enjoyed because it meant that you met people in a very personal way in advance of joining the training sessions. And also knowing that in order to do the security in a way that didn't intimidate people, and assured them of their safety and our commitment to the safety and security, that I introduced them in a way that was kind and caring, and yet had to, you know, do body searches and check through their bags and stuff before they joined. So it was.
What was the criteria? Tara, what was the criteria that you mentioned? What did that entail? What kind of criteria did one have to pass to be on the flotilla?
People needed to have already proven themselves as having solidarity with Palestine. And some people didn't really fit that criteria. They hadn't been outspoken about Palestine, or they hadn't been involved in any of the solidarity initiatives regarding Palestine, or they had, you know, there were some people who, it's a little bit uncomfortable to say out loud, but some people raised suspicions, and when a suspicion was raised, there's very little that can overcome that. Also, people whose personality showed that they could be involved in direct action that meant they needed to be in close quarters with strangers for a long time. And so I suppose, years of seasoned experience in the human rights field meant that I have an empathetic feeling for people and good judgment, I suppose.
Do you have a nose? Do you have a nose for recognizing Mossad, undercover Mossad agents? Because I would have thought that they would have been monitoring all of your activities in the build-up and would have been quite keen to be part of your flotilla. Is how they operate.
Have a good sense of smell. There were people who tried to sabotage, and some of the boats did get sabotaged. So it's never a flawless execution, if you like, of interview. But, you know, I think we did well. I think that the people who were on the Alma certainly came together. Everybody worked really hard there were daily tasks, and there was never nothing to do. So myself and Fra and Tig, you know, we were the Irish brigade, if you like. It was quite fantastic. And from the moment that we left Barcelona, between the three of us, we managed to influence for something that was quite holistic and transparent, and, you know, people enjoy being together from the offset. We had fantastic nights of sharing history from our different countries and our different heritages. Chief Mandela spoke about South Africa and apartheid, and how the Dunn Stores workers had come out on strike for them from 1984, a summer which I remember clearly. They wouldn't handle goods from apartheid Africa. Then we had Omar Faris, who gave fantastic talks about Palestine and the history of Palestine. So, you know, and also Tig Hickey hosted open mic nights. So we had singing and song and, you know, tremendous amusement, and it bonded us and brought us together as a group.
It sounds amazing. And Fra, of course, I don't like necessarily focusing on well-known personalities, but people like to hear about, you know, the way those guys react, simply because that's the way a lot of people are wired out there. And I can't not ask about Greta, who was so castigated in a way and so frontline in terms of the climate change stuff. I wasn't a big fan of the climate change agenda personally, and it was very easy to start, you know, poking fingers. But in a way, her commitment on the flotilla and standing up for Palestine, that was quite a shock for a lot of people. What was she like, or how did she cope with the whole situation? And what was her real personality? Because people probably have a lot of images of her which are quite negative, I would have thought.
Yeah, well, I'd have to say that I'd seen Greta Thunberg through other people's eyes, through other people's lenses, including the propaganda lens of the mainstream media, the television and the newspapers. So I had seen her on the previous boat. I think it was the Handala. I'd seen her smiling when she was offered water, smiling when she took a sandwich from the IOF baby killers when they got on the boat. And then people were castigating her, people who I know are dedicated Palestinian activists back home at Belfast. Did you see she signed her deportation orders, couldn't wait to get away, just using Palestine for an activist tick list? But I got to see Greta Thunberg through my eyes. I got to see her as a human being. I got to see her as an activist. I got to see her as someone who has a soul, someone who is passionate, someone who is as committed to Palestine as I am, or Tara, or anybody else who was on the flotilla. I was washing the dishes with Greta one day. She took part in cleaning the toilets, washing the dishes, drone watch, everything every activist did on that boat, she took part in. She was willing to sleep on the floor because we had only 6 berths and we had 24 participants on the boat. So we had people sleeping on the floor, sleeping on the couches that were in the cabin, and also some, we had 5 or 6 beds, berths. So the boat was really for 6 people. And we had 24 people on the boat. So she took her turn sleeping on the floor, sleeping on the couch. I met someone who, if I didn't know of her persona, and I didn't know of her kind of public face, then I would have just seen someone quiet, unassuming, a good sense of humour. I'm more than happy to muck in with everybody else. And Mandela was just the same. He did the drone wash, he cleaned the dishes, he helped keep the boat ship. So I was very impressed, and I want to echo something that Tara said. Like, obviously we all came together as strangers, and I'd like to think we all parted as friends. But in between, I never felt judged, and I never was judgmental towards anybody who was on our boat. I just met people that I could have a conversation with. I could sit down and have a cup of tea and ask them about their politics, or in some cases I stayed off politics. I knew my politics wouldn't be in line with other people, so I just thought, you know, I'd gone along to get along. I'd made a commitment and a promise to myself before. I promised myself if I apply for the flotilla and I'm granted a place, I'll go. And then when I get on the flotilla, I will not be the cause of any disruption or dissent, or any cause of concern for anyone on the boat. But I found that role very, very, very easy because everyone was like-minded. We were all going to Gaza. We were all trying to challenge the seas. We were all trying to highlight the ongoing genocide and ethnic cleansing of the indigenous people of Palestine. So that's why we were there. So it was very easy for people to jail because we were on a mission. So we had a focus.
So that's some lovely insights into the way people worked, and some of the people probably wanted to hear about those well-known names. But moving on to the actual account that you gave me of these drones, that sounds terrifying. Because when I was following it, it was in the port in Tunisia when I heard of the first attack, and I think you mentioned something about that. But was there no way to be protected? I mean, the Tunisian authorities, etc., did they give you any security? I mean, Tara will probably back this up, but how did it feel when that first drone arrived? And I thought it landed on the deck and there was an explosion. I could see fire. There was a sort of a mini or a minor or large explosion. I couldn't tell because the flare was making it unclear as to how much the damage was. But what did that whole feel like, being involved in that?
Okay, well, firstly, I never had any real anxiety or fear. I wasn't preoccupied with what might happen on Interception. I was taking every day, one day at a time. I was preparing myself for possible interception and possible sabotage and possible drone attacks. But we didn't believe, personally, that it would happen so soon. We were all thinking, oh, there's a yellow zone, an orange zone, and a red zone. So 100 nautical miles from Gaza is the red zone. That's when you can expect to be intercepted, if that's what happened. So my mind was on the last 5 days of the journey, not the first 5 days. But when they attacked the family boat in Sidi Bouzid, I was on the Alma. We were literally like 30 meters away, like 100 feet. And the CCTV coverage shows a flammable liquid, what appeared to be flammable liquid, being dropped and ignited from the drone. They set fire to the boat. Okay. So that happened the first night. On the second night, we'd watch what happened, the family. And I'd suggested, should we put out our fire hoses? Because, you know, possibly the same thing could happen. So the fire hoses were deployed the following day. And then whenever the same incendiary device was dropped onto the Alma, because we had an upper wooden deck, the captain and crew had it put out within 15 seconds. So there was a forensic analysis of what happened on the family. And the Tunisian forensic authorities said this was a carelessly discarded cigarette butt. It set fire to some of the life jackets. Nothing to see, move along.
So the Tunisians covered it up, basically.
Well, they did on the first one because the CCTV showed exactly what happened. But on the second one, part of the device was saved. They were able to give that to the forensic people in Tunisia. Then we had a naval escort, and then we had anti-drone technology. So we went from Sidi Bouzid to another port called, I think it was Gvir, okay? And what they had was anti-drone technology beside the boats of the flotilla that were at the jetties and at the port in this other part in Tunisia. So we were given a full naval military protection escort. But to my mind, it's only done because first they denied the attack on the flotilla, which is an attack upon sovereign nationality of the Tunisian state. The second one proved that they were going to continue attacking the boats if it wasn't stopped. I think the Tunisians, the government and the president, didn't want to have to go to the UN, go to the ICC, go to the ICJ, demanding that Israel be held accountable, had it been proven that they were responsible for these attacks. So it was easier for them to appease their own internal citizenry to say, we're protecting the flotilla. But yeah, so the 2 bombings, then the 10 attacks out at open sea, along with a chemical attack, which we think was hydrogen sulfate. So they dropped these flashbang grenades in order to damage the sailing ships and discourage people from continuing the journey. So,
but it didn't stop the flotilla. They carried on. Tara, Fra very graciously offered to get involved in a mission that was there to support the flotilla, and it meant he had to go to a port. And the rest of the flotilla that went on obviously got to that zone where it was still international waters and it was still kind of not inside Israeli maritime, if you like, territory. But you were attacked, and you were still on the boat. Fra, I think, had left by that time to go on a little rescue mission, but you were still there. So first of all, there was an act of piracy that occurred. Israel basically violated maritime laws. They violated just about any law that you can imagine on the high seas. But tell me about what happened when they did make their major move, when the Israeli actually made their move on you.
It was very fast. The first night, they surrounded our boat, and it was pitch dark, but we could see that it was a naval vessel, and they just very close to us. I mean, they were so close we could have reached out and touched the boat, and they spun around and around and around the boat to, we definitely could have been capsized, but we were trained so well. I mean, the training that we did in advance of Interception was daily. We did drills every day. So we were all in our life jackets. We went up to the top deck, and because the boat was being thrown back and forth, many of us lay down on the top deck and just waited And then nothing happened. They left, and many of us had already thrown our phones into the water at that point. So we couldn't contact our families anymore and let them know that we were okay. However, the ground crew knew everything that had happened, and other people on the vessels were in touch with them. So our families, heard that we were all right afterwards. We just couldn't contact them ourselves. So the following night, um, we knew in advance that they were coming because we could see on the horizon the naval vessels, and we were also told by our coordinators who were part of the land crew what we were expecting, because they could also see through satellites and technology. Um, so it was basically, all of the Israeli naval vessels.
How many could you see, Tara?
I'll say this because
Was it easy to see how many there were?
dozens and dozens of them. I mean, it was, like their little armada coming towards us. But, there was a moment of absolutely not panic, but there was fear that was palpable in the air for a flicker of a moment. And then it took them an hour to get to us. But when they arrived, it was Shayatet 13 that came on our boat. So it was the notorious Commandos. It was really fast. We moved very quickly from our muster point up the stairs to the top deck, and we just waited on the top deck for them. And within seconds, they boarded the boat. Everything was pitch dark. They came on board. They were all wearing the most fantastic US taxpayer funded regalia that would have put Transformers to shame. It was, they were fully decked out with weapons and different types of explosive devices and bullets. And that was quite stunning when they came onto the vessel at first. It was silent, and they said, "We're the Israeli military, and we don't want to hurt you. Do as we say, and you won't be harmed." And at the same time, they were ripping down all of the satellite stuff that we had on our ship, pulling everything apart. They came onto the deck. We moved back. We all had our hands in the air. We were very calm and quiet. Nobody said anything. And they took us one by one and searched each of us. They took our passports. They stole my frontline defender's card from out of my passport. And then it was probably, I would say, an hour and a half sitting there. And then they told us to go down to the lower deck. They had really destroyed the inside of the boat. Everything was strewn all over the place, and lights and stuff pulled off the ceiling. All of our cupboards had been emptied out. There was stuff from the bin and stuff from the fridge all mixed up on the floor. It was just a mess inside. They had taken cushions from the sofas and everything and put them on the floor so that we could sit. And they knew that we would be sitting for the next 16 hours. We were all piled on top of each other. A couple of people had been zip tied. And we sat there under their rifles for the next 16 hours until we got to Ashdod port. They were all wearing balaclavas, so we could only see their eyes. Not all of them. Some of them had their faces revealed. After a while, a couple of the women soldiers. And one guy, obviously it was tense for a while. One of our participants was staring one of them out of it. And finally the soldier said to him, "Why are you looking at me? Stop looking at me." And he raised his rifle, and, there was the red dot on the guy's forehead. So he stopped looking at him, obviously. And after a few hours, we were allowed to use the toilet under guard, not inside the cubicle, but under guard down the stairs. Then eventually,
were they physical at any point with the crew? I mean, obviously they know the entire world was watching this. So do you think they were being a little bit better behaved than they might otherwise have been? Because the way they dealt with the Mavi Marmara was, like, of course, completely violent to the point of murder, basically. But here they seem to have obviously regulated themselves.
Definitely, absolutely, you could feel that they were being restrained. I mean, they behaved it was, they were gruff, they pushed people around, they pulled people around, but it wasn't that same level of viciousness that they used with the Palestinians at all. We were treated, I would say, comparatively very, very fairly. And they, they were really holding themselves back. Some of them, there's three levels. There's yellow, green, and red, or rather green, yellow, and red. There's the good cop, bad cop kind of thing. And some of them, my God, like you would have held your breath around them. They were so vicious. It was, on their skin. But yeah, we were treated very fairly. There was nobody was hit in the head with a rifle. Nobody was beaten viciously in front of other people. They really restrained themselves. And I think they knew the world was watching. This was also something that they had never experienced before, this kind of really peaceful, non-combatant, pacifist reaction. And at the same time, we had been very well trained ourselves in how to react to them. So it was really, there was a lot of composure and restraint.
And when you finally arrived at the port, was it Ashdod? You say, what happened there? Because I've seen interviews with Tag, for instance, and he talks about being out in the sun for hours and hours, deliberately, roasting in the sun, and their behaviour seems to become more violent once they were on land. What was your experience?
Well, the people who were on land behaved very differently to the commandos who were on the ships. We were kept until nightfall, so we were really under armed guard from the time that we were intercepted until the night of the next day, because people were being transferred onto our boat before they went on land for administration. So we could see people from different boats. At that point, I think the soldiers were tired and maybe even a little bit bored, because we were, there was nothing to provoke them at all. We were able to make cups of tea and coffee, and somebody made noodles and spoon-fed one of the guys who still had restraints on him. So by the time we were ready to go on land, they called out Mandela and Tiago Avila from Brazil, and also Greta. So they were processed separately to us. However, we were then all bunched together when we were all in that big group that is pictured on the international media. I was taken off the boat. One of the commandos gave me his hand to help me get off the boat. I'm not great at getting on and off boats, I gotta say. But he gave me his hand to get off the boat, and then the guy who took me onto land grabbed me by the shoulder and drag marched me to where the group was. So there was an immediate change in attitude. I was brought into that group of people and thrown onto the ground. It was a pavement at the port where there were hundreds of us all sitting together, many in stress positions. I was zip-tied in a stress position and sat there for a couple of hours. Ben Gvir came out and paraded some other soldiers in front of us and shouted, and he gave us the victory sign, called us terrorists and Hamas and baby killers. And then an American guy who is a Jew spat at him, and then people started shouting "Free Palestine." And Ben Gvir was so shocked that we reacted in that way that he was affronted, and off he went. He walked in front of all of us, shoved a couple of people, and then off he went. So there was then a heightened sense of we were reacting then as a group. We weren't afraid. There was no fear of them. We kind of felt that one of the girls actually started screaming "Free Palestine," and she was dragged off separately, still screaming. So there was that kind of militant element that came. It was quite fantastic actually to be part of that. And we were brought in to be processed.
Well, I'll come on to that process phase in a moment with you. Bear your thoughts, just give you a chance to collect your thoughts. Obviously, there's a trauma involved with these things, which I'm sensitive about as well. But Fra, you were stranded in Crete, having volunteered to be the hero of the Alma, but for your sins, you ended up having a pretty hard time of it down there for 10 days or so, struggling away with this little boat, which was much more which was sounds like a big ordeal in itself, to be fair. But if you could just tell me, now that you've heard in retrospect what happened to your friends, people now who you knew on a very personal basis. Maybe you didn't hear so much about it when you were in Crete, but subsequently you've heard the stories and you've probably talked to some of them. Tell me some of the things that have shocked you, some things that have disturbed you about the way your colleagues were treated by the Israelis.
Well, first of all, on a personal level, I'm disappointed. I feel I let the people down in Gaza, and I let the people down on the boat, and I let myself down because I didn't complete the mission. Just to put things in context, when the family boat broke down, they asked for volunteers to leave the Alma. I saw myself as a guest of the global Sumud Flotilla. This wasn't my boat. It's not up to me to say I'm not prepared to leave. When they asked people to step up, I stepped up. I was among the first to put my hand up and volunteer. The boat I was subsequently transferred to, I was only on the boat 2 minutes. The captain says, I don't know why they put you on this boat. This boat is broken down. We're going to Crete. The idea was we would have repairs within 48 hours, rejoin the flotilla in time for either the interception or to get to Gaza. 48 hours became 6 days. 6 days became 7 because we then needed a seaworthy certificate from the Greek authorities. They said the boat was safe to go back to sea, at which point we'd missed the interception. We had hoped to join the Conscience and the 1000 Madeleine.
The follow-up flotilla.
Exactly. And then on the Sunday morning, I read the message, 2 a.m. Thank you for your steadfastness. Thank you for your continued kind of trying to fulfill the mission. This boat will now take part in the next flotilla. So basically I was encouraged to stand down. But everything that I've heard from Tag Hickey and from Tara and from other people, I mean, Greta Thunberg was dragged by the hair, forced to kiss the Israeli flag, had it draped round her while they took photographs to humiliate her. She's not even talking about that in the public domain. She's saying it's about Gaza. That's all it's ever been about. And what happened to Tag and Tara and Paddy, the captain we mentioned earlier, a man in his 70s, type 1 diabetes, needed his insulin. They took his medication off him when he was detained illegally. They then refused to allow him to have that medication. And when people asked that a doctor be summoned, because you can go into a diabetic coma, the man could possibly die.
Sure, it's a life-threatening thing, yeah.
The guards looked in the eyes of the people asking for a doctor and said, we don't have doctors for animals.
For animals?
That's exactly the words that Tag used on the George Galloway show. I'm very specific about what I'm saying. I'm not surprised by any of this. I have been watching the release of the Palestinian prisoners yesterday. I watched the reaction of the man who was told his wife and children had been martyred and murdered in Gaza. That man collapsed upon realizing, emotionally overwhelmed, that his brain just short-circuited when he spent more than 2 minutes with his wife and his 2 children. The emaciation, the stories of torture. Someone else talked about being kept in the cell naked 24 hours a day, humiliated psychologically, beaten physically, and starved of sustenance for the body. I mean, these people are the new neo-Nazis. These people are Zionism to me. What happened to people in the Second World War seems to have created a similar mindset that the Nazis had, which is one of supremacism, that their lives have more value, other people's lives have less value. And as a colonizer, you must dehumanize the indigenous in order to displace them through replacing them. So we've seen it in North America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Hundreds of millions of Indigenous people massacred, wiped out, genocided. That's what we're seeing in Palestine.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise us, does it? I mean, when people from the IDF can video themselves committing the atrocities they had and celebrating the genocide, one wonders that when they are not in front of a camera and they have access to these 13,000 Palestinians plus, that they've basically got the capability to do anything to, and they do, because the reports of rape, of sodomy, the reports of torture, cutting, using dogs to attack them, to scare the living daylights out of them, but actually to bite and kill. Basically, they could do anything they like in there, because with a government like Bibi Netanyahu's and people like Ben Gvir in charge of these prisons, they literally are people who are saying these are Amalek, these are animals in a way, these are not humans, and we're allowed to do whatever we like. It's something that we have to really take seriously, because previously everybody has also said, of course, that this is nothing to do with Judaism and this is not to do with Jewishness, but Ben Gvir would argue that he is the Jewish, the quintessential Jew, and he would say all of this is in the Talmud and all of this is part of what our rabbis bless. And it leaves us all in a real situation, because at the one side you don't want to be anti-Semitic, and at the other side it's not a religion's fault, clearly, necessarily, but if there are people who are violent extremists who are using that religion or using scriptures from within that religion, and they are willfully brainwashing and dehumanizing their own people with these ideologies, then it's got to be called out. You can't just hide that. We did it with the Muslims. I mean, I'm a Muslim myself, and we were subjected to 20 years of questioning about what we believed and whether terrorism was an inherent part of Islam, or what was it that was wrong. The reality is that we know that there are these manufactured, politicized aspects that are within religious doctrines which are manipulated in the Muslim world. It's the Takfiri, Wahhabi, Daesh fraternity who have been organized by a deep state. In the Jewish fraternity, is it a case that this is a strand which has been developed by these nefarious groups? And again, they're actually totally destroying the reputation of Judaism and Jews themselves. And this Jewish supremacy is actually something very dark. I'll throw that to Tara as probably one of the last questions, because it links into the justification that Ben Gvir would have had to do what he was doing to you guys, Tara, is obviously something that he has in his head and is something that he believes in, and which actually a lot of people like Smodrich and others, he's not alone. There's a lot of people who believe in this stuff. And you got, I think, a minuscule, perhaps, amount or taste of what the Palestinians are going through in terms of this ideological hatred of them as a people, this kind of racist, expression, which in prisons becomes like violence on steroids. But just give us another little hint of what it was like in there, in those prisons, even for the short time that you were there.
We were caged. It was 40, 45 degree heat, and I was zip tied and put into a dog box for about 4 hours with freezing cold air put on top of me, with another girl, an American musician, beside me. And we actually, from the pain of the zip tying and total fatigue, we both passed out and woke up into the fresh hell of Kidsfield prison. We were pulled out and put into cages there were like metal hooks on the floor that they would have used to chain, ankle chain or wrist chain Palestinian prisoners, and we didn't have that. We were left in the cage and there were like 60 of us maybe in the cage, and there were girls who had gotten their period and they had nothing to help themselves with. We had been strip searched again. Not strip searched, we were stripped and thrown prison uniforms, which I very quickly put on. And then I tore the sleeves off my t-shirt for one of the girls to help her. Some of the women who were hijabis had their hijabs pulled from them, so they used their t-shirts to cover their hair. Then we were put into these mortar brick huts with barred windows on both sides. Um, we were paraded around the prison yard. There was a big banner in front of us with Gaza, a picture of Gaza absolutely destroyed on it, and underneath in Arabic was written "The New Gaza," and an Israeli flag over that. Inside the cell, there were 15 of us on filthy mats on the floor. With the cell had been whitewashed inside, but you could see the writing of people. Hundreds of people had written underneath there in Arabic, English, and in Hebrew. What they had written their names or the date or whatever. There was a tiny little cubicle inside the cell that was a filthy, filthy tin toilet and a tin sink, and some of us went on hunger strike immediately and water strike. Every evening they paraded commandos in full uniform with dogs in front of the cell. We were moved from cell to cell. I spent 72 hours at least in the cell without being given any time in the yard. We never got to wash. There was never a shower. The food was shoved in through a letterbox in the door. We were screamed at constantly. They would open and close the cell doors, slamming them. We had sleep deprivation. And we were keenly aware that all of the time we were there, that it was absolutely nothing in comparison to the suffering of Palestinian prisoners. And we knew that at some point we would be released. And, we had fantastic conversations. It was like a university of resistance being in there. Some women were pulled out and really degraded publicly. And yeah, it was hard. I won't deny that there is a lingering trauma from it, but I knew that we would be released, that there were hundreds of people appealing and advocating for us in the background. And I knew that this was one of the most public arrests and detentions and illegal detentions, to be put in front of a judge who was accusing us of having arrived in Israel. My question was, do you admit that you came with the flotilla to Israel? And I said, no, I came with the flotilla to Palestine. And you're indicted by your own words. And it's an illegal arrest, and you're prosecuted for doing something that wasn't illegal. So, yeah, I'm relieved to be home. But there's a part of my head that is still in that cell, and that I have a feeling of empathy for the Palestinians that I wouldn't have had without the profound blessing, actually, of being in that cell. It was like it was the ultimate end to an incredible odyssey of a voyage that, yes, we failed, but at the same time, there was a triumph because I know that it shined a different light. I saw afterwards, my kids showed me, Mom, this is something that happened because all of those Israeli vessels were distracted by you. And it was an absolutely bountiful fishing expedition that the Palestinians had managed to achieve, that they got some fresh food, that kids had managed to swim in the sea without being fired upon. And I cried. I cried. There was something beautiful about knowing that I had been part of a distraction, at least for a little while.
Well, it's obviously very heart-rending to hear the stories, but every time you talk about your incarceration, my mind goes back to what's happening to 13,000 Palestinians plus every day, and the million that have gone through those prisons. So, and just in conclusion, Fra, focusing on that, you see, when I hear about these stories, it just makes me think. When the world says that ceasefire and peace is an objective, I say, okay, ceasefire and peace is fine, but how? How do you have peace with a mindset which Tara has described, the one that the one we know, but is becoming much more openly obvious? Donald Trump is lauding himself for bringing a peace deal and offered actually the Palestinians nothing other than the fact that there's not going to be an open genocide. Justice and peace. Can there be justice without peace? Can you have liberation as an objective? Is liberation of Palestine not something that should be achieved rather than these kind of fake ideas of peace. Is that the objective? Is that the takeaway even from the flotilla, that ultimately we've got to be fighting for the liberation of Palestine?
Well, I'd like to speak on a personal or in a personal capacity. It's important for me that we move past ceasefires. We move past calling for sanctions upon an apartheid, racist, nuclear-armed fascist state, and that we move on to de-legitimizing Israel. It was born in violence. It exists through violence. It expands through violence. No Israel means peace in the Levant, peace for the Ummah, peace for West Asia. So it's time to end the Israeli racist apartheid state and bring about one nation from the river to the sea that's Palestinian. And if it was up to me, I'd allow the Palestinians to decide who gets to live with them in that shared space.
Thank you, Fra. Thank you, Tara, for sharing that very traumatic kind of set of memories. I know it's never easy. And for those of you watching, this just gives us a little hint of what Palestinian reality is. If we were deluded that there's some sort of holiday camp, or that these areas run by the Israeli occupation force are some sort of Butlin's holiday camp, well, you've kind of pretty much got the idea, because you can't even begin to imagine, the kind of disease, the kind of horror, the wounds, the trauma, the psychological torture, the waterboarding that these poor guys have to go through. And all we hear is about Israeli hostages. We're told they're hostages, they're not prisoners of war. But the Palestinians, the 1 million that have been through those prisons, they're of course prisoners, and they've done something wrong. They're obviously criminals. Clearly there's a lot of Hasbara which has been totally destroyed, and I think the Sumud Flotilla has been part of that process of destroying this Hasbara. And that's the first thing we need to do, is to get out of the hypnosis which Israeli and Zionist Western media have really inflicted upon large parts of the world. You need to wake up to the reality that this is injustice, this is tyranny, this is oppression, and it doesn't matter whether it's a brown face, a Palestinian face, or white face. Whoever is subjected to such tyranny, it must be opposed, it must be dismantled, it must be destroyed. There is no excuse for it, and there's no justification, no matter how many times the Israelis harp on about their need for security and defense. The fact is, they are the problem. They are the ones who are creating insecurity. They are the ones who are creating tyranny in that region. This is undoubtedly the case. And we shouldn't also be thinking now that just because a fake ceasefire has been initiated to cover up the crimes of the very people who are saying they negotiated these ceasefire, whether they're Zionist Arabian leaders, or whether they're the Israelis and Zionists themselves, Netanyahu, or whether it's Trump and the British Brigade. All of them are involved in the genocide. All of them continue to persecute and commit tyranny on Palestinians, even now. And I think that we need to escalate. It hasn't got to be a case of down tools, which is what they want you to do, because they're trying to lull you into a false sense of security. Say, oh, nothing to see here. There's a ceasefire. It's all right now. Everything's fine. Israel's safe, and the Palestinians, they're not safe. Palestinians are not safe. It's not over. Liberation has to be the destination, I believe. That's my honest opinion. Thank you for watching this edition of Deep Dive Perspective, and do like, share and subscribe to the channel, because our kinds of channel, of course, are censored. They stop us from really voicing. There's no such thing as real freedom of speech, and even on social media we get banned and suppressed and censored. It's only with your support, share, like, push us out there, that at least we can get the voices that need to be heard, the voices like Tara and the voices like my friend Fra. They're the ones telling the truth, and if you don't believe them, then you need to do a little bit more investigation yourself, but have a critically questioning, thinking mind. Don't listen to the legacy media's Hasbara and the Israeli propaganda, because that's just basically barefaced lying. Thank you for watching.